Just a couple of brief announcements. Next week, Wednesday, we'll be having Valerie Olson from UC Irvine talking about water from an anthropological perspective, so something a little bit different. And then the week after is our student research poster presentation session, which is always enjoyed by all, so everyone is welcome to that. So this noon, it's a pleasure to welcome Sarah Anzia, who is the Michelle J. Schwartz Associate Professor of Public Policy and Politics at UC Berkeley. Dr. Anzia received her dissertation from Stanford University, received her PhD from Stanford University, and her dissertation on election timing and the political influence of the organized received multiple national awards, highly prestigious awards, and in time resulted in a book called Timing and Turnout, How Off-Cycle Elections Favor Organized Groups, which also received a number of national awards. She's done research, of course, in politics and elections, in public sector unions, and pensions, obviously the topic today. Also women in politics, including an interestingly titled paper called The Jackie and Jill Robinson Effect, Why Do Congresswomen Outperform Congressmen? She is a recipient of a number of national awards, as I mentioned, including the Jewel Lowenberg Award from the Legislative Studies section of the American Political Science Association. She's given talks at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, MIT, Columbia, UCLA, and the Commonwealth Club of California. And finally, she's a little known fact, perhaps she spent a year as a member of the Oakland Ballet Company. So, with no further ado, it's a pleasure to welcome Sarah Anzia.
Thank you. Thank you for coming to hear me speak about this very important topic. Frankly, I think most people would rather pretend it doesn't exist. But because the nation's pension problems usually aren't headline news. That doesn't mean that they're small or that they're going away. They're actually big, and in most places, they're not getting better. Now, when there's an imminent crisis, or when it comes to cities and states that have severe problems, we tend to hear about pensions. So we hear a lot about Chicago and Illinois. This is a recent Crane Chicago forum that was titled Defusing Illinois' Pension Bomb. Chicago's pension plans are at risk of becoming insolvent, and recently Mayor Lori Lightfoot asked the state of Illinois for help with its pensions, and Governor Pritzker responded by saying, quote, "There are not liabilities that can be adopted by the state that would not drive us into junk status." A few years ago, Rhode Island got a lot of attention. In this New York Times article, they called Rhode Island the little state with a big mess and wrote, because of pensions, "Before this is over, many Americans may be forced to rethink what government means at the state and local level." And here in California, we hear about pensions probably more than in most other places for a lot of reasons, I think. Because CalPERS and CalSTRS are so big, because Stockton and Vallejo, their bankruptcies were related to pension costs, and also because, as I'm going to show you, California stands out as a place where pension costs do tend to be higher and are growing more rapidly than in other places, in most other places. But there's this real question, which is what conclusions can we draw from these cases, like Chicago, Vallejo, Stockton, San Diego? You know, some people make all kinds of claims. Some people say this is happening everywhere. Its pension costs are high, they're rising, and they're crowding out government across the United States. Other people say it's just a few bad apples, and most places aren't experiencing any kind of crisis. Things are mostly okay. Now, until now, it's been really difficult to evaluate those claims and say which one is closer to the mark. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to start with about 10 minutes, 15 minutes of background, just because it's necessary. I'm going to describe the problem, what it is, and also how we got here, in particular focusing on the political contributors to the issue. And then I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about some data that will show us what's actually going on with pensions in local governments across the country. in the trenches, how it's affecting these local governments. I've collected 12 years of data on the pension expenditures of 442 municipalities and counties across the United States. I've combined them with US Census data on local government finances and employment. And what I'm going to show you today is, how much do local governments actually spend on pensions? Basic question. How has that changed over time? How are those local governments responding to changes in their pension costs, any increases in their pension costs? And in the end, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what this means for you, what this means for government employees, what it means for policymakers. All right, so that's where I'm going. But before I can get to all of that, I have to start with the background. All right, so first, a quick overview of what these pensions are and how they work. You probably know that most government employees in the US are eligible for a defined benefit retirement plan, or a traditional pension. That means that as a state or a local employee, when you retire, you earn a fixed amount of income for as long as you live. And that amount is based on your age, your final salary, there's some different ways of defining that, a multiplier, and your years of active service. So that's different from a defined contribution plan. Defined contribution plans now tend to be more common in the private sector. The model here, you can think of it like a 401k. The employee sets aside money for retirement. Usually the employer matches. That money is invested, and when you retire, you have what's in the account. There's no defined benefit. Okay, so most state and local governments in the US participate in a relatively small number of state-operated pension plans, about 115 of them. There are, however, many local governments that also operate their own pension plans. In California, you know these names. The big state-operated pension plans are CalPERS, CalSTRS, and UCRP, which is me. In theory, the model of funding these pension benefits is sort of simple. So the benefits are supposed to be pre-funded, meaning that governments, taxpayers, set aside money, they contribute money, so do government employees. They contribute money for the employees who are working and earning those benefits right now, today. Then that money is pooled and invested, and that fund is used to pay benefits to retirees. So it does get more complicated than that pretty quickly, because in order to figure out how much needs to be set aside by government employers and employees today to pay for benefits in the future, you have to make all kinds of assumptions. So you need assumptions about how long retirees will live, how long they'll work for government, how are their salaries going to change, and how should we discount future liabilities, all right? Here's the thing. Regardless of how accurate those assumptions turn out to be, the benefits have to be paid. So regardless of how well the investments do or whether the assumptions are correct, the benefits must be paid. So if there isn't enough money set aside, somebody has to make up the shortfall. Okay? That, in a nutshell, is the problem. That there isn't enough money in the pension funds to pay for the benefits that have been earned by public sector workers and promised to them. And those benefits are backed by legal guarantees, so they must be paid. In total, state and local governments' public pension liabilities are underfunded by somewhere between $1.28 trillion and $5.2 trillion, depending on whose estimates you use. So these figures are from the Pew Center on the States, based on data from fiscal year 2017. And it's showing you the percentage of total pension liabilities in each state that are funded. Okay, in case you're interested, the lows here are the dark blue ones, and the lows are Kentucky, Illinois, New Jersey. Here's the thing. So estimating public pension liabilities is complicated. Like I said, there's debate about what the public pension liabilities actually are. And most finance experts agree that the numbers that governments themselves provide, which are the numbers that Pew uses, are too generous. So in other words, funding levels are lower than this. Now, most of the variation in people's estimates of pension liabilities has to do with what discount rate is used. For example, there are so many different estimates I could show you. These are from Joe Nation at Stanford, who runs Pension Tracker. In some of his estimates, he uses a 3% discount rate. That's where the $5.2 trillion number comes from. This map was created using his data, and it presents unfunded liabilities per household in the state. The Fed recently estimated underfunding at $4 trillion, so I'm not going to get into all of that. I'm not going to sit here and spend a lot of time talking about what the correct number is, because I think we can agree it's big. It's big. And let's just say that, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background on how we got here, how this happened, focusing in particular on the politics of it. Okay, in very basic terms, two things have happened. First, governments over time have made public pension benefits more generous. Second, governments have not contributed enough money to fund the benefits that have been promised. What this means now is that governments today are having to pay for the more generous benefits, and they're paying more to accommodate those growing shortfalls. Okay, so that's what's happening, and I'm going to say a little bit about each one of these things. All right, let's focus on the first. So governments have sweetened the benefits over the years. That, of course, makes them more expensive. So what that should mean, that alone should mean that once you increase benefits, governments and employees should be contributing more each year to pay for those better benefits. In normal times, by which I mean not times of crisis, so think not right during the Great Recession and the aftermath. In normal times, it is very, very tempting for elected officials to increase benefits. Most voters are not paying attention to what's going on with government employees' pension benefits. But certain people are paying attention. Government employees tend to pay attention. They tend to be well organized, and they're paying attention. And they have incentives to push for better benefits. Who is the active force pushing back when it comes time, when it's being proposed that we should increase pension benefits? Well, in normal times, nobody, right? Nobody is saying, no, maybe we should think about this. And you might think that cost considerations would constrain policymakers, right? Because, well, if they're going to be more expensive, maybe they'll think twice. But here's the thing. With pensions, elected officials can basically promise better benefits and just not pay for them right away. So eventually, it will become a problem if they don't. Eventually, there won't be enough money set aside to pay for the benefits, but by the time eventually rolls around, the politicians who scored the political points for increasing the benefits are gone, and it becomes someone else's problem. Okay? So that is the basic dynamic I want you to see. That changes during times of crisis. So during the Great Recession, all of a sudden people are flooded with information about how pensions are in bad shape. You can just see that in the number of news stories in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times on state and local public pensions. Not much happening, 99 to 2007, then all of a sudden you see 50, 70, 90 stories per year being published on the subject, okay? So suddenly people are hearing a lot about pensions. You can also see sort of the crisis change when, if you look at the kinds of bills that are being passed that affect pension benefits. So here, my co-author and I coded all state legislative bills that changed the benefits of public pension benefits between 1999 and 2011. And we coded them as either expanding pension benefits, the green bars, or reducing pension benefits for new hires in the orange bars. You see a pattern here, right? Until 2008, 2007, the game is expanding pensions. California to Wyoming, everybody's doing it. And then suddenly you get the recession and there's effort to reform pensions, to scale back pensions. But again, most of those orange bars, those bills are for new hires only. Okay, so one thing I've heard a lot over the years as well, and you read a lot, is, okay, if someone's out there expanding pensions, it's got to be those Democrats, right? The Democrats are sort of the big government party, and they have labor in their they have to respond to public sector workers. But we looked at state legislative votes, so individual state legislators' votes on expanding public pension benefits. Okay, well, up until 2008, 1999 to 2008, yes, Democrats are overwhelmingly voting to expand pension benefits. So are Republicans, right? So are almost all Republicans. It's not until 2009 or so that you see Republicans, some of them starting to vote no on expanding pension benefits. So what do I want the takeaway to be here? Normally, there's a lot of incentive to increase pension benefits, and it's not a Democratic or Republican thing. It's really both parties. Okay, there's a second problem here, which is that governments haven't been contributing enough to fund those pensions. This happens in a lot of different ways that are difficult to see. When it comes to decisions about what gets contributed to pensions, however, it's important to focus on state pension boards. Okay, the legislature, state legislature is certainly involved. However, a lot of the important decisions about what gets contributed are made by state pension boards. What are these boards? So for the major state-operated plans, it's typically a group of 5 to 15 people. The boards usually have some ex officio members, like maybe the governor or the state treasurer. They have some trustees who are appointed by elected officials, trustees to represent employers, trustees to represent citizens, taxpayers. But also, nearly all of them have trustees who are supposed to be active or retired government employees. 95% of the big state-operated pension plans have these employee or retiree trustees. And it's important. Typically, they are 50% of the board or more, right? So when you think of these boards, a major theme here is self-governance, that the beneficiaries of the plan play a role in deciding and managing their pensions. The other thing to recognize is that the employee and retiree trustees usually are elected by employees and retirees. So that's how CalPERS does it. They have 6 members who are elected by employees or retirees, beneficiaries of the plan. Okay, now why do I go into all of this? Because people always say, well, yeah, but it doesn't matter who they are. Everybody has a fiduciary duty to the trust. They are just supposed to be doing whatever is best for the plan. And yes, that is true. The problem, though, is that they also have other incentives. They have political incentives. Whether it's an ex officio member, a political appointee, a government employee trustee, they all have some incentives to underfund pensions. Right? Okay, to contribute too little. This is maybe easiest to see for any elected officials, the ex officio members and the political appointees. Instead of contributing large sums to pensions, they would rather do other things with that money. They would rather fund other government programs. They would rather cut taxes, depending on which side of the aisle you're on. So especially since any consequences of underfunding aren't going to be felt right away. Now, if you just think about it, though, government employee trustees also have incentives to underfund pensions, their own pensions. Now, people usually say, oh gosh, did she just say that? Did she? And yes, I said it. So people say, why wouldn't employees and retirees want to make sure that enough money is set aside for their pensions? Wouldn't they be out there making sure that these are responsibly funded? Well, sure, but think a little bit more. Their benefits are guaranteed regardless of how well funded they are. So that's the first thing. Also, government employees and public sector unions have interests in making their pensions look affordable to the public. If all of a sudden state and local governments have to contribute much more to pensions, what that does is it draws everybody's attention to how expensive these benefits are. That builds momentum for reform, right? It might build momentum for cutting benefits. Okay? It's going to make it more difficult to get any benefit increases. In addition, if state and local governments suddenly have to contribute much more to pensions, that means less money for other priorities of government employees and public sector unions. Salary increases, hiring more people. It's the same money. So the thing is, employees, even the employee trustees, have incentives to underfund pensions, their own pensions. Now, what does this mean, just stepping back? To put it bluntly, virtually all the people involved have incentives to underfund pensions. Now, how they do that is complicated, right? So it happens through a host of decisions that are difficult to see, like the choice of the discount rate. Okay, if you set the discount rate high, that makes future liabilities look smaller. That means you don't have to spend as much money, contribute as much money today to, quote, fully fund the pension. Okay, so as of 2001, the typical discount rates used by major state-operated pension plans was like 8% or higher, okay? If you still are questioning this idea that maybe government employees, they're going to be a force for pushing for responsible funding, note that as of 2001, the plans that had more employee trustees on them typically had higher discount rates, not lower, right? So that's not what you'd expect if they're out there saying, gosh, we really need to be contributing more. So that's one way underfunding happens, through the assumptions, like the discount rate. But once those actuarial assumptions are made and they figure out how much has to be contributed to fully fund the pensions, there's still no guarantee that governments will actually contribute that amount, right? So nobody's forcing them. So between 2001 and 2014, for the 109 state-operated boards that my co-author and I studied, 57% of the time, the board and the state legislature paid the full actuarially required contribution. 43% of the time, they did not. You might say, well, it's better than half, but keep in mind, 43% of the time, they're not contributing what they are supposed to, even though baked into those numbers are the assumptions that are already making these numbers look too low. So this isn't as good as you might think. Okay, so that in a nutshell is what's happened, right? That governments over time have increased benefits, making them more expensive. Because of strong legal protections, once those benefits are increased, they can't be rolled back. They can only be changed for new hires, and governments have not set aside enough money to pay for the benefits because of the political incentives of the various decision makers. So here we are. Okay, so the reason I go through all of this is to give you some sense of what the problem is and how this happened. Big picture. But for the rest of my time, I want to talk about what this is doing to local government in the US and in California. We've heard a lot about a few cities and states with big problems, as I said in the beginning, Chicago, San Jose, Stockton. And some people say what's going on is happening all over the country and it's getting worse. Two political scientists, Rod Kiewit and Matt McCubbins, have written that because of pension costs, we are experiencing and other things, we are experiencing the onset of the new fiscal ice age, in a period in which a given level of state and local tax revenue purchases a considerably lower level of current services. All right, so that's one take. Others say this is an exaggeration, maybe even a fabricated crisis, and that we can't draw sweeping conclusions based on the experiences of a few cities that have really serious problems. Okay, so to quote Alicia Munell and co-authors, the question is whether cities across the country are about to topple like dominoes and whether pensions are the problem. The answer appears to be no on both fronts. Okay? All right, where are we? Which of these is, how do we even think about this? And the thing is, we don't actually know. A few years back, I was sitting around with an MPP student who was really interested in pensions. And I had already been learning about and studying pensions for a long time. And I asked, well, gosh, what do local governments even spend on pensions? What are they spending? How is that and how has that changed? And we realized we don't know. We don't know. There are no data on local government pension expenditures. And so you see, there's this large body of work, research on public pensions, but almost all of it is using certain kinds of data. Data at the state level or data on pension plans. These data are great, don't get me wrong, I have used them, but they tell us about what actuarial assumptions are being used by different plans. They tell us about their funding ratios, but they do not tell us what individual governments are actually spending on pensions in a given year. Because if you wanted to do that, you need some data at the level of the government, so local governments, right? So, and those data haven't existed. So I think this is actually really important for bigger reasons. So we don't even know the basics about what's happening in local governments. I think that this has shaped the national conversation about pensions in an important way, in a way that discourages public engagement, that encourages ideological posturing, and allows people to dodge really politically difficult conversations about the policy trade-offs of public pension spending. Look, discussions of public pensions are usually about the things I've been talking about, like plan level quantities, unfunded liabilities, actuarial assumptions. These are difficult to understand. Most people don't have a sense of what an unfunded pension liability is, what the discount rate is, or why, what the implications of any of this are going to be for them. It doesn't help that when people talk about underfunding, it's always talked about in terms of like things that are going to happen in the future. The pension fund will run out of money in 2035, right? So that seems far away. Here's another thing. These things like the discount rate on the value of unfunded liabilities are debatable. People debate them all the time. And so what that means is that competing interests are jockeying for different numbers, and that allows them to take different positions on the seriousness of the problem, right? And the need for any kind of reform. So I think that what we need is a shift in the conversation. We should be talking about basic things like, okay, how much are our governments spending on pensions? How has that changed over the years? What are governments doing to accommodate any growth in pension costs? It's easier for people to understand that. It makes it clear what's happening to governments now, right now, and it's less debatable than discount rates. Okay, so I'm going to describe a long data collection project I did. Over the course of the last 2 to 3 years, I collected a new data set, and I want to acknowledge that this project was funded by the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment, and the Berkeley Institute for the Future of Young Americans. Thank you to all of those organizations. What I did is I selected roughly 800 local governments across the United States of different sizes, different kinds. Municipal governments, county governments, school districts, and special districts. And I attempted to collect 12 years of comprehensive annual financial reports for each one, from 2005 to 2016. Now, from each CAFR, each of these reports, I pulled out how much they spent on each of their retirement plans each year, and I built a data set of each local government's pension expenditures. I'm making it sound easy. This is really quite difficult. I mean, just getting the reports takes time. Then someone has to read the relevant sections, and to put it nicely, most local governments do not make it easy, or many do not make it easy to figure out what they spent on pensions. You're sort of like deciphering code in some cases. But what we have now is a data set that's entirely new. No one has put such a thing together, and they stand to tell us a lot. So I'm going to talk about that. A few things I want to note before I get into it. These are data on what the local government is actually spending on retirement plans, not what it should be spending. Okay, so it's agnostic about what they should be spending and whether these numbers are close to that. Okay, but what they're actually spending is what I care about for this project, because that's the number in their budgets, right? That's the thing that's going to be affecting their decisions. I'm also only looking at employer contributions. So it's pretty common for governments to agree to pay some or all of employees' contributions as well. This is called employer-paid member contributions, EPMC, or pickup. You might have heard about this. Turns out local governments are inconsistent in how they report any amounts they're spending on behalf of employees. I tracked it where I could, but they are not included here. I excluded other post-employment benefits like retiree health care. Okay, so maybe I'll come back in 4 years and have something on OPEB. But those expenditures are not included. And also, I did my best to track interest payments on pension obligation bonds. But again, the reporting on interest only from these reports is not consistent. So in what I'm showing you, any interest payments on POBs, pension obligation bonds, are not included. All right? Okay, so I'm going to use these data to show you some basic trends in local government pension expenditures. In the presentation, I'm going to focus on municipal and county governments, not school districts and special districts, but stay tuned for a separate school districts project. I have at least some year's pension expenditures for 442 counties and municipal governments. In everything I'm going to show you, what I've done is I've summed the total amount for each city and county, how much each city and county spent per year on their retirement benefits across all of its plans. And I've adjusted these for inflation. So everything is going to be in 2016 dollars. All right, so let's start with basics. How much do local governments spend on their employees' pensions? We don't want to just look at total pension expenditures. Why? Obviously, LA County is going to spend a lot more than the city of El Cerrito, right? It has a lot more employees. It has a lot more people. So what I'm mostly going to show you is pension expenditures per employee or pension expenditures as a share of general revenue. This shows you how much each local government spent as of 2007 on pensions per employee, okay? I think this is probably the best way of thinking about pension costs because pension costs are a function of how many employees the city or county has. If you increase employment, you're contributing on behalf of more people, so your pension costs will go up, right? So this, I think, is a good way of thinking about it. These are deciles. So what this means is if you take all the data and you sort them, these are the numbers that break the data into 10 equal parts, okay? Just to give you some a way of thinking about this, the median local government spent $4,901 on pensions in 2007 per employee, okay? But there's a lot of variation. And even in this early year, this is again before the bottom fell out, okay? 20% of the cities spent less than $2,175 per employees. 20% of the cities spent more than $8,534 per employee. And one thing I want to point out here is that the cities and counties with the highest pension costs spend much more than the others, right? So the top 10% of cities, as of 2007, per employee pension costs were greater than $11,704 per employee. So that's much higher than the median. Okay, California. There are 26 California cities and counties in the data set. So they're about 6% of the data. 18 of the 26 California cities and counties were above the 90th percentile. So meaning they're in the top 10% of pension spending per employee as of 2007. Right? The other California localities were above the median by quite a bit, except for Fresno. For all we can tell, Fresno did not contribute to pensions in 2007 at all. Okay, so one other thing to point out is that pension costs per employee as of 2007 are clearly higher in local governments that are in states with strong unions and mandatory collective bargaining. Okay. Here, all I'm doing is grouping local governments into categories based on public sector union membership in the state and whether there is a state law requiring collective bargaining for local employees. And you can see that costs are higher in places that have stronger unions and collective bargaining. This is another area where I know, a lot of people do not like this. This is exactly what we should expect. So public sector unions can be expected to push for better benefits for their members. And even if the formulas themselves are not more generous in places with collective bargaining and stronger unions, we know from research that salaries do tend to be higher when employees are better organized and there's collective bargaining. And public pensions are calculated based on employee salaries, right? So don't be shocked, right? This is what you should expect. And this is true even when I account for the cost of living in a place and how urban it is, right? Now, there's also a lot of variation in pension expenditures as a share of local general revenue, which is what I'm showing here as of 2007. Again, these are deciles. In the median local government in the data set, pension costs were 3.1% of general revenue as of 2007. But again, the top set of cities and counties are spending a much larger share on their pensions than in the rest. So in the top 10%, it's as of 2007, 6.4% of general revenue. All right, now, how have pension costs changed? We're looking at 2007. What's since? Okay, here, there are a few different ways of looking at this, and I'm going to explain this. So one easy way of thinking about how pension costs have changed is just percent change in total pension expenditures within each of these local governments from 2005 to 2016. So how much did pension costs change within each city and county over 12 years? That's what I'm showing here. So on this axis, you see percent change, okay? So this is a 100% change, 200% change, 300% change, right? So 100% change means pension costs doubled within 12 years. You can think of the height of these bars as telling you something like how many cities and counties fall within a certain range of growth. So you can see that most of the cities and counties are here, but some are much higher, and there are a few cities that are way out here. Okay? A few things I want to point out about this figure. First of all, this number is positive for almost all of the cities and counties. So 88% of these cities and counties have experienced real increases in their pension costs since 2005. Second, the median is 56%. So it's hard to see here, but the median is 56%. So what does this mean? The median local government in the data set saw its pension costs increase by 56% from 2005 to 2016. Okay? Third thing I want you to see is this long, what we call a right tail, right? So that like a lot of the data are clumped here, but then they're a lot spread out here. Okay, so in 26% of the cities and counties, pension costs more than doubled in 12 years. In the top 10% of cities and counties, pension costs grew by 189% or more, all right? And in some cities and counties, there have been extreme increases in pension expenditures. A lot of those are in California. The median growth in pension costs in the California cities and counties was 77%. Now, let's be clear. Pension costs can increase for any number of benign reasons. What if these governments are just growing? What if they're just hiring more people, right? Then they're going to be spending more on pensions. Well, it doesn't look like that's the case. So here is pension cost growth per employee from 2007 to 2016, okay, in thousands of dollars. So again, these are thousands of dollars down here. So if you see a 5, that's $5,000. In the median local government in this data set, the amount spent per employees on pensions increased by $1,216 over this 10-year period. But you can see that there are a lot of places where per employee pension costs increased by, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 per employee. Sometimes more than $10,000 per employee. How does California stack up? In the median California city and county in these data, pension costs increased by $7,022 per employee over this 10-year period. Okay, and in a typical local government, pension costs are growing as a share of general revenue also. That's what I'm showing you here. 75% of the cities have seen pensions make up a greater proportion of general revenue. Here, the x-axis is just proportions, so total pension expenditures over total general revenue. The median, again, is a point that pensions accounted for an additional 0.8% of local general revenue over this period, but for California cities, an additional 2.7% of general revenue. Okay, so this, I think, is another way of looking at what's happened in California compared to the U.S. as a whole. This, the bars are just median pension expenditures per employee per year. And the yellow bars are for all of the U.S. local governments. The blue are for California local governments exclusively. And you can see that even early on, the blue bars, cost per employee in California, are much higher, right, than in a typical place in other parts of the U.S. You can see that the yellow bars are absolutely growing, but the blue bars are growing more. Okay. So one last thing, has pension cost growth been higher in places with strong unions and collective bargaining? Yes, it has been. This just shows you median growth per employee from 2007 to 2016, broken down by union membership. And you can see that per employee cost growth has been higher, quite a bit higher, in places with stronger unions and in places with less than 50% public sector union membership in the state. And that holds even when you exclude California and can account for all sorts of characteristics of the cities. So there you have it. That's what's happening with pension costs. Pension costs have increased almost everywhere in the U.S. since the mid-2000s, whether you're looking per employee as a share of general revenue, big cities, small cities, Texas, California, but there's huge variation in the extent of that growth. So San Jose and Chicago, they're not representative of what's going on in the rest of the country, but they're also not alone. There are a lot of places that look a lot like San Jose and Chicago that have seen very, very rapid, pronounced increases in their pension costs. So how is this affecting what local governments can do? All right, well, to put it simply, there are a few ways local governments might respond. They could increase revenue. They could try to decrease costs elsewhere, maybe by reducing the number of employees. They could issue debt, like pension obligation bonds, or they could reduce pension costs. So I'm going to focus on the first two for good reasons. The first is any attempt to reduce pension costs would be reflected in my pension cost data, right? So I'm just setting that aside. Second, pension obligation bonds. So as part of my data collection, we did look through every CAFR to see whether they mentioned they had issued such bonds in the past or whether they're paying off such bonds now. Actually, I was sort of surprised. A relatively small share of these local governments had issued pension obligation bonds, 38 out of the 442. But they're disproportionately common in California. So again, California is 6% of the data, but 14 of the 38 cases that had POBs were in California. So, I'm not going to be looking at POBs here. I'm going to focus on, are these places increasing revenue? Are they cutting costs? And I want to be clear that they can do various things in response. What I'm going to be looking for is trends in how they respond, okay? Whether there are clear links between pension costs and how local governments operate. First, I'll focus on revenue because, again, this is one way they might respond. I don't have data on specific actions, like did they increase tax rates, did they increase certain fees, but I do have data on their general revenue and their own source revenue each year. And I'm also going to evaluate whether there are any reductions in service provision that we could see. This is also difficult to do because we don't have good measures of service provision for hundreds, thousands of local governments across the U.S. So what I'm going to do is focus on local government employment levels. In a lot of ways, this makes sense because local governments, a lot of what they do is provide services, and the way those services are provided are through people, firefighters, police officers, teachers, okay? So I'm not going to get into the details, but I wanted to put this up for those who are interested. What I'm doing is running a series of statistical models where I'm looking to see whether there's any clear association between the size of a pension cost increase in a local government and the size of any change in their revenue or employment, okay? So I will walk through what this means. These are the initial results and their regression coefficients. So let me explain what these mean. These first two bars here represent the average effect of a 1% increase in pension expenditures per employee on general revenue the following year and own source revenue the following year. All right, so what do you see here? The dot is the point estimate. These are confidence intervals. You can see that on average, the answer is that there's no clear relationship between the size of a pension cost increase in a place and what their general revenue the following year. So it does not look like the typical local government is responding to pension cost increases by increasing revenue. All right. These next three bars, however, are estimates of the effect of a 1% increase in pension costs on employment levels. This is full-time equivalent employment per capita. This is full-time equivalent employment, this is full-time, and this is part-time. So what you can see here is that there is a clear relationship between the size of a pension cost increase and reductions in employment the following year. All right? Rather than interpret these bars, I'm going to give you a couple of scenarios that show you what this means. So take a city, imagine a city of 100,000 people that's seen a small increase in its pension costs, 25% over this time period. The model predicts that this kind of 25% pension cost increase would come with about a 1.63% decrease in full-time equivalent employment per capita. In a typical city of 100,000 people, that would be a reduction of about 17 employees, okay? 17 city employees. But that's a small reduction. So take the same city that's seen a doubling of its pension costs. There, the expectation would be that the typical response would be a 6.4% decrease in employment or the loss of 65 city employees in a city of 100,000 people. Okay, do these effects depend on whether you're in a strong union state or a collective bargaining state? Yes, they do. They appear to be more pronounced. The employment reductions appear to be more pronounced in places like California with strong unions and collective bargaining. Now, for those of you who are saying, stop with the models, please stop. This is just a simple way of looking at the same thing. No model, I'm just plotting data. Okay, the green lines, I'm looking at 4 examples. Sacramento County, Salinas, San Mateo County, Sunnyvale. And the green line is just showing you pension expenditures over time. The orange line is showing you employment in the city or county. You can see the green lines are going up, the orange lines are going down. Okay, that's what's happening in many places. All right, so just to sum it up for you, here are the key findings. Through the collection and analysis of these new data, we learn that local governments do vary dramatically in how much they spend on pensions. And in places like California, they even early on were spending more than in other states. Second, pension costs are rising just about everywhere. Blue states, red states, weak union states, strong union states. But the size, it is true that cost increases have been larger in places like California. Third, pension cost increases do not appear to be linked to revenue increases down the road. They are linked to employment reductions. Smaller government, fewer jobs. Okay, so what does this mean? Why do you care? This is an issue that most of the time stays in the shadows. And it's not that way because it's a small problem. I suspect it's that way for other reasons. The first is the one I've already talked about, that most discussions of public pensions revolve around quantities that are hard to understand, discount rates, unfunded liabilities, and experts debate these values, but most people do not understand how a discount rate change affects them. Also, here's the other thing. There's little to no immediate risk that current government employees are going to lose their pensions. That's good. However, it removes a sense of urgency. So look at Congress. Last week, the U.S. House rushed to the rescue of private sector workers enrolled in multi-employer plans, truckers, miners, because they're at risk of losing their pensions, okay? And a lot of those people live in the Midwest, and turns out they're going to be really important in next year's elections. Now, that's not the case with government employees, right? They're not in immediate peril, right? They're not at risk of losing their pensions in the short run. So the policymakers let the problem roll on. But what my data show is that just because the consequences are less direct and less visible doesn't mean there are no consequences. Local government is being affected by rising pension costs. It's not a future thing. It's happening now. And I think, this highlights some really important trade-offs, even for government employees and for their unions. All too often, debates about public pensions are framed as being like pro-worker, pro-pension versus anti-worker, anti-pension. I think these data show that that's too simple, because as pension costs are going up, especially in places with stronger unions, there are fewer government jobs to go around. Okay, so gnaw on that one. And really, this affects everybody. It's not just government employees like me. Pension costs in many places are going to continue to rise, putting local governments in a position where they have to cope in some way. And so everyone who relies on local government services, police, firefighters, teachers, parks employees, and that's everybody, stands to be affected. So these data show that in many places, as pension costs increase, local governments are responding by shrinking their workforces. Okay? That means that going forward, especially in places like California, we can expect that our local governments will be doing less with more. Thanks, and I look forward to your questions.